All right, and we are live. So, welcome to Question Christianity tonight. Hope everybody who can joins us. Feel free to jump in on the comments. If you are on the main Question Christianity page on Facebook, we will be able to see any comments you drop in the chat, and we will interact with those. This is a very interactive group. So the goal is not for us to talk at you. The goal is to talk with you. So if you are in the live chat, feel free to comment. There's usually a slight delay. So if it takes us just a minute to get to your comment, we'll still get to it as long as you're on that main Question Christianity organization page on Facebook. So please feel free to interact with us through there. Anyway, tonight we are going to be starting a new topic. I do want to give some brief introductions to everybody here with me, though, for anybody who hasn't attended one of these meetings yet so far. So down here right below me.
Should I look up like on the
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Caleb.
This is Charles Graves.
Hi.
You want to say a little about yourself?
Reasonable Faith chapter director for Roanoke. Maybe that's about it. How's that?
Good. Over
Long
here,
time listener, first time caller.
Over here to my left, or right, you're right, is Kevin Smith. Would you like to say a little about yourself, Kevin? Oh, we can't hear you. You're still muted, sir. There you go.
Story of my life. I like philosophy. I teach some, and this is a good group.
Over here below Kevin is Pete Good.
Hi, how are you? I'm going to unmute my microphone, but I'm going to mute back here in just a second because it gets echoey. I'm Pete. Been doing apologetics since I went to an apologetics seminar, I think in like the 7th or 8th grade. Been listening to, can you actually believe this sort of stuff since then? And I've got some other friends who are part of the Norm Geisler community down in Charlotte. To me, this is a way to figure out, can I believe the gospel? And by believing it, can I share it? And is it kind of like what Charles says, is it reasonable to have this kind of faith?
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody, for your introductions. And I'm Caleb Johnston. So we've been doing this for a little over a year at this point. We were a local group, and we have since, given the pandemic, we have taken this online. So again, this is all about interaction. So please feel free to interact with us. Right now, we're currently going through a series on common objections to Christianity. So we've looked at whether or not there's good reasons to believe that a God exists. We then spent some time looking at miracle claims and some of the objections that come up with those. And tonight we're diving into a whole new subject and really taking things in a different direction for a little bit. So we're going to be looking at, why should you trust the Bible? So that's going to be our topic for probably the next few weeks. I think it's going to take us a little while to get through this one. We're not going to exhaustively be talking about everything. What we'd really like to address is any questions people have. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. If we're not going to get to them at some point in this discussion, then, we will try to address it as soon as it comes up. And if otherwise, we'll let you know, hey, it's going to come up later in the discussion. So we're going to dive in. I want to make sure before I play this video, I cannot hear it on my end, but I think everybody else will be able to hear it. So as long as you guys can hear this, give me a thumbs up. We always start out any of these kind of objections by taking a look at a video that makes some claims about the topic we're discussing. Just to kind of give us a realistic take on what some other perspectives are. So tonight, I've got a video from Hermit Meta. Not sure if anybody's familiar with him, but he is I think his page is the Friendly Atheist. And he puts out some very interesting content.
Definitely heard of him. Never seen him.
Okay, well, now you have. So I'm going to try and play this video. Just give me a thumbs up if you're hearing sound. I put on captions so I can read that, and I've seen it a couple times, so it doesn't matter if I can hear it, but I want to make sure you guys can.
An author named Cameron Files recently wrote an article for my website, and he gave me permission to use that material for this video, so credit where it's due. One of the arguments that atheists often make in religious debates is that we shouldn't trust the Bible because it's a 2,000-year-old book. You know, the science is wrong, the morality is bad, and we've progressed so much since then. Now, that's all very true, but it's still a bad argument because it lends some support to the Christian myth. Here's why that is. If you say the Bible is a 2,000-year-old book, you're basically saying it was written around, the year 15. And a lot of people say that Jesus was born in the year 4 BCE, and he died 33 years later. So basically what you're saying is that the Bible was written sometime during the life of Jesus. Actually, you're saying that the Bible was published before Jesus died, which doesn't make any sense. And if you think the Bible is actually 2,000 years old, there's reason to think that people were writing accurate histories of that time. All those miracles written in the New Testament, Jesus rising from the dead, you might actually think you're reading firsthand accounts written by people who were there. That is not the case at all. The Bible is just a big game of telephone, with people passing down these stories generation after generation. And not just stories about the Garden of Eden, but about those miracles too. The Gospels, for example, weren't written until 50 years after the death of Jesus. I mean, that's a lot of time for history to be rewritten. That's basically like us revisiting the entire JFK assassination, minus the videotape, minus the journalists, minus Walter Cronkite, and with only a handful of witnesses, none of whom were the ones actually writing this stuff down as it happened. Okay, so it's not a 2,000-year-old book. It's actually like a 1,900-year-old book. Does it really make that much of a difference? Yes, it does. Because the oldest surviving copies of those texts date back to the mid-2nd century, and they weren't much to work off of anyway. So you're talking about writing and rewriting these stories for about 100 years before they even started to resemble anything like the Bible we have today. In fact, the oldest complete New Testament manuscript we have dates back to the mid-4th century. I mean, that's 300 years after Jesus died. So the Bible is a book that's less than 1,700 years old. Most of the copies we have, most of the old manuscripts we have come from the Middle Ages. And it wasn't until the 17th century that we finally got the King James Version of the Bible. So forget taking the Bible literally. I mean, DNA is an amazing replicator, and even it makes mistakes. You mean to tell me the people copying down the Bible by hand got it perfectly right every time? Whenever the Bible was written, I can tell you this. It wasn't 2,000 years ago. It's much younger than that. There was a lot of time that passed between when Jesus died and we had the very first accounts of his life. And remember, we're just talking about the nonsense in the New Testament. The Old Testament is even less reliable. So don't grant Christians the luxury of having a 2,000-year-old book. They don't have one of those. They have a book that's maybe 1,600 to 1,700 years old that went through a lot of revisions and probably has a lot of mistakes when compared to the originals, which we don't have. For those reasons, You certainly shouldn't call it a book that's divinely inspired. Just call it a book of mythology. That works equally as well. My name is Hemant Mehta, and I write at friendlyatheist.com. What do you want to see a video about? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll be sure to check it out. And don't forget to subscribe.
Okay.
All right.
Where do I begin? Okay, let me.
I know there's a lot to unpack in that video. That video is full of claims.
Well, I'm sure we're going to dive into all of these. I guess my first question, and maybe it's not answerable, my first question is just to wonder does he really think that everything he just said is academically correct? I wonder if he believes what he's saying is actually academically true.
Based on some of his other videos, I'm not sure he's really concerned with his claims being academically accurate. That's making a big assumption on my part, but
He's the friendly atheist, not the academic atheist.
good point. Good point.
I mean, some of this stuff's just like academically understood to be not viable, but I'm sure we'll dig into that.
Oh yeah, we're going to spend some
Really interesting to talk to
into
that guy. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Sorry. Please continue.
Well, so before we kind of move on, does anybody in the chat or anybody here live, does anybody think he actually had like valid points he brought up or critiques that, are valid or things that made you go, I hadn't heard that before?
Well, until someone else would say something on the live comments, which I would fully endorse, I'll just say that I've heard a number of things that I thought he said that were correct. So, but that's kind of the problem, isn't it? It's like it's not that everything he said was totally off base. Some of the stuff is logically correct. It's the stuff that's intermingled with that. But maybe I'll let someone to comment to be more specific about some of the concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I'd really love it if we had. I see Pete has provided us a straw man drawing. So, yeah.
So to that point, there's several arguments he was making, and again, I should have been sitting here jotting down notes, but there are several arguments that those of us who believe Scripture, you've got the notes. There are several arguments that those of us who believe Scripture, we don't actually claim. We don't claim it's a 2,000-year-old book. Not academically, we don't. We actually do give it some age. I do believe that there are new manuscripts that came out that may be somewhere in the range of 60 to 80 years after the death of Christ. Kevin, I guess you'll have to answer that. But I know that we have things that are copies of copies. And the interesting thing about the telephone game claim is if I pick up a phone or if I whisper something in someone's ear, the minute I quit speaking, which sometimes my wife wishes I would do more often, is that the words evaporate. They're gone. But when I write something on paper, I don't know if you noticed that the straw man is still there on paper. It's really interesting that if I copied, let's say, the word straw man, and then my wife, who speaks Spanish, if she wrote that down in Spanish and then handed that page to somebody else, and then maybe somebody else wrote it again in English, and we kept handing out these copies, not even photocopies, just simple handwritten copies, the copies don't disappear. So we can compare them copy against copy against copy and kind of go, well, what were they saying? Mm-hmm. And then we could take our Spanish copy. Maybe I write a paragraph. We could take our Spanish copy and maybe somebody else's Romanian copy or somebody else's, Greek copy. And we can actually take those and kind of say, well, we kind of know how Greek would translate to English. We know how Spanish would translate to English. We know how these other languages would translate to English. And we know that the original was written in English. I think we can probably figure out pretty close what was originally written because we have all these copies that agree with each other. And we can see where the errors are. I won't steal all the thunder and don't want to do a lecture, but it's...
Let me add something to the telephone metaphor. So the telephone game is a game that was invented for the purpose of having fun through specific rules that were intended to make messages go astray. You know, there's also, you're not allowed to repeat. You can only whisper it to one person. You know, you're not writing anything down. Usually it's a complicated phrase to begin with, you know, some nonsensical type of thing. So there's all types of things built into the telephone game purposely designed to corrupt messages. And there's all kinds of things, I'm sure that we'll go into, that go into manuscript transcription that are designed to do just the opposite, to ensure that the message is valid, correctly copied, and without error. Although, like one of the things you said, yeah, they make errors. The question is, could we know that? If they made errors, could we know? Would we know?
Yeah, I think if we follow that line, again, when we play the telephone game, it is a game, as you said, but as you said, just one person at a time. So if we imagine, you know, have a starting point, then you have a circle, and it comes back around to the starting point. Then you compare what you started with what you ended with, right? That's the game. So in the typical game, there's just this one circle. As you said, Charles, you can only tell one person at a time, and they take turns. But what if the first person who was told could turn around behind them and tell someone else who starts their own circle? And the second person who was told in each circle could turn around behind them and start their own circle. That's what manuscript families are. Yeah. So you would have a multiple attestation of each statement at each stage of the development of the progress. And that's what a family of manuscripts really looks like, this concentric circles, weaving out circles. So you have so many manuscripts at so many points to compare, even if everybody makes a mistake at different places.
Correct.
You can see where they all agree at every other place. And scientific, empirically comparing that data, which is what linguistic analysis do, then you can see what the original was, just a pure number crunching of terms. So it's not this oversimplified telephone circle, much less a game. And that's what he's misrepresented, among other things.
That's a good point, and we are absolutely going to dive into that along with some of the things Pete touched on. You know, I do want to touch on a couple comments here before we move on. Kevin's got lots of fans in the chat. He's being flirted with by his wife here in the chat.
How come I don't see anything in the chat?
Oh, you're not seeing me pop these
there
up
it is.
on
Okay,
screen?
I see. Yeah. No, yeah.
And then we've been called slapheads, so that's nice. Nobody thinks you have hair there, Charles. You've got a little bit left, right? Yeah. See?
I like this. So I'm going to leave you guys for my wife. See you.
Somebody wants you to do a dance, Charles. So yeah, so a lot of stuff relevant to our conversation here. But he has offered to rub my head.
All right.
So, all right. So lots of comedians in chat tonight. So we're going to move on and get to some of these objections. We're actually going to start off, as we have every one of these, by looking at why people may have some of these objections. So one, people may have tuned in for a video like this by Hermit Meta and taken him at his word. there's lots of people who may have never heard exactly how the Bible was transmitted. That certainly makes quite a difference in terms of how you look at some of these issues. For example, the example of the telephone game is one of those big ones. People may be concerned about the internal consistency of Scripture. They may be concerned about human fallibility. And one of the big ones, I think, is some people may disagree with some of the implications of the Bible being true. Now, it's not to say that's the only objection. It's not to say that there aren't valid objections. But those may be some reasons that people disagree. Any thoughts on that, guys? Any other reasons you've heard?
No, I mean that's a pretty good list.
All right, hold on a minute. Okay.
I think that summarizes the primary categories, honestly.
All right.
Maybe you might add that there's just the presupposition that there can be no God, or there can be no such thing as miracles. So that by the time you enter and read anything that describes such, then it's automatically dismissed. It must be false. There's kind of a priori predisposition, which then might be explained by some of these. So that they might, as soon as you see a miracle, someone might say, well, okay, it's obviously false. So then where did it come from? So since you've assumed false, now you can go to the next step and say, well, then what happened? And use maybe one of these items as a description as to where it went wrong. But you really first have to prove that it's wrong before you can describe why or how it went wrong.
That's true. Susan brings up another example here of the claim that it's made up like the Book of Mormon. We certainly heard some of that in Meta's video as he kept referring to it as mythology. Also, she asked a question about the difference between translated and transmitted. Anybody want to give a quick clarification on that before we move on?
Well, translation, I think that one most people would understand, and we mean that in the most common sense, which is from one language to another. So there might, if many people have heard the claim that the Bible has been translated so many times that it's no longer reliable, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But to the question of what was it? Translation versus transmission. Transmission is more like the propagation of the message outward. So starting from a certain location and even maybe a propagation through time. So when it was originally written, and then as it's copied and propagates through time and geography, maybe that's transmission. I feel like I could probably use some help on that one, though.
One thing I was going to say about translation, it's one thing to, again, I mentioned a moment ago that my wife is fluent in Spanish. We understand what Spanish, if she were to say a phrase, let's just imagine for a moment I didn't understand it, but there's a person who does, somebody else, a translator. They understand what the words mean, not just what he thinks they mean, but what they mean in context in today's culture. It's a different thing altogether to translate a document or conversation that happened, decades ago or centuries ago, much less when we start to go millennia ago, where words may have had slightly varied meanings, and you have to say, hey, ancient Greek means different. That word in ancient Greek means something slightly different than it does in modern Greek. And so you have to go to what the meaning of the word was originally. And people might have kind of a valid claim of, well, the words don't mean the same things. You know, we even have those same conversations about the U.S. Constitution and the founding documents and things that the forefathers of the U.S. made in writing. Of course, we're going to have those same kinds of commentary about old writings, but it's people have done their homework. I haven't. Kevin has. I haven't. You know, and it's doing the homework and knowing that this word actually meant something specific and what that specific meaning was in the ancient days. Not just what the words also meant, but also the hermeneutics, which is a fancy way of saying this letter was written to a specific audience during a specific time in a specific geography. And what was it saying to them? And of course, part of that is also what do we gain from it today? But it's the translating the words and the commentary based on the words and what they meant in history.
And I think those are both good summaries, and we're going to get into really breaking this down some more as we kind of move through this. This is a lot of material to cover in the next couple weeks, so bear with us, stick with it, and come back if you're not getting answers to this sufficiently from watching just tonight. Come back next week, because this material all really builds on one another as we kind of look at this question as a whole versus just trying a quick objection to the claims. So before we kind of move into some of that, let's talk for just a minute about the Bible. And maybe one of you two wants to jump in and clarify. Susan asked, so does translation go along with transmission?
It can, but not necessarily. So as documents are propagated outward, they might be translated in the process, but maybe not necessarily.
Right. I mean, at the end product for English users, both would happen in tandem, but they are two distinct actions. But I mean, you could just strictly transmit early Greek texts, and then at a certain point, the best of those manuscripts would be the basis for translating into another language. Like for Luther, his breakthrough was putting the Bible into the people's language, German, in his country.
Yeah.
But he's using transmitted Greek texts to do his translation work for the people. Now we have larger, peer-reviewed groups doing that, but it's going to work together in the end.
Yeah, and maybe one of the cool things that we have sitting on this side of history is we're not stuck at the end of the telephone game. And I know we're going to go into this in more depth. So we're not stuck at the end of the telephone game, even though it's not even like a telephone game. So as Kevin described, maybe a simple way to understand it, it's not linear, it's exponential. It's the best mathematically. But anyway, but even wherever we are in history, we're not stuck at the end only listening to the last guy. The cool thing about being here at this part in history is we get to go back and look at all the stages that are available. So, we can go back and look at what manuscripts they had in maybe the Middle Ages, as the gentleman said. We can go back and look at the manuscripts that they had in the 400s. We can go back and look at the manuscripts in whether it's Greek or whatever language. We can go back and look at those, and we have thousands upon thousands of these ancient manuscripts that we can go back and look at. So that's kind of the benefit. So kind of get back to answer Susan's questions. It's like translation and transmission. We can go back and look at both and then do our final translation now. So we can kind of do a huge survey of all the historical documentation we have, and then now, as Bible makers are still doing, they go, all right, let's translate it like based on everything that we have in this, this huge wealth of information. Now let's do it. Let's do a modern day translation, or let's do a modern day translation in Spanish, or let's do a modern day translation like the word on the street, or something like that. So, yeah.
And I would say even, some of what might modernly be considered a translation, there are a few instances where these current translations are more of a paraphrase transmission rather than a real translation, which this may not be a problem right now so much as it could be, a couple hundred years from now, if somebody takes it as saying it's a translation when it's one that's not really. It's just somebody's paraphrase.
Yeah,
but just to anticipate an objection there, not that people a couple hundred years ago would rely on an English translation or paraphrase to build a newer, more contemporary at that time translation. They would use the same ancient and reliable manuscripts that we would at any point along now. But yeah.
I think, and I want to be very sympathetic because I've heard it a number of times, but people are maybe even justifiably confused when they think about the Bible. And it's like, okay, there's the King James, and then there's the NIV and the ESV, and you got all these different translations, and some people are using this one, and some people are using that one, and some people are using both. And gosh, if there's so many translations, even if they're based on Greek manuscript, there's so many current translations. It's just it's a very confusing thing if you don't understand what's attempting to be done there. So,
no, absolutely. And I think it's important to know where translations came from. There's, in a lot of the modern day translations, there's explanations in the front part of the Bible that explain what the translation committee did different than other translation committees, what they looked at, which manuscripts they relied on. And Susan mentioned the Cotton Patch Bible. I'm not familiar with that. I was thinking more of the Passion translation. So I don't know what she meant there, but I haven't heard of that.
Just as well.
Okay. So anyway, to move on a little bit, and we'll come back to all this stuff. So if we don't touch on a question, feel free to bring it back up when we're kind of in that section again. First off, I wanted to touch just briefly on what the Bible is, because there's a lot of confusion over this, I think, among people who aren't as familiar. And one thing is the Bible is not a single book. It's a collection of books, 66 to be exact, 39 from the Old Testament and 27 New Testament books. It's written in 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And it's also, books contain various types of literature, ranging through law, history, poetry or wisdom literature, and prophecy. So what are some of the challenges we may face when reading a collection of books of this nature?
So I'm a science fiction guy. I really enjoy Isaac Asimov, and if you read the collection of all of Asimov's writings, it has a very cohesive tone. It's also a very a good constant genre, and so you get similarities in word choices. You get a lot of things. It's science fiction. It's not pretending to be a law book. It's not pretending to be a textbook. It's not pretending to be a newspaper. So you kind of know what you're getting to. Because these are really ancient documents, and we're looking back through, the colored lenses of history and in modern culture back at those histories, you're reading sometimes a poetry writing, but are you reading it like it's a newspaper? Or are you reading chronicles like it's just some mythology and never happened, rather than the Book of Chronicles being a history book where they're chronicling the happenings and the day-to-day, or at least the event-to-event types of actions. And so because of that history and that, absence and distance from the cultures, sometimes you don't know what you're reading. You don't know, am I supposed to be listening to this more literally? Is this more figurative? Again, it's that hermeneutics component where who's it written to? What style was it written in? Why was it written to them? That sort of stuff. Again, let's let those folks, because they're the smart ones, actually unpack that.
So, and I think Susan raises some good points with this as well that go right along with what Pete said. The books aren't chronological, so of course that presents a challenge. And then language has changed over the time since the books were written. The Hebrew language is very different from the English language in a lot of ways. She also mentioned, another good comment here, that we might not understand when a reference or a parable is used because it was directed at the people of the time. Just as us saying, a reference to what's going on with this pandemic now, or, a joke about a toilet paper shortage wouldn't have meant anything, 5 years ago, or maybe 100 years from now. There may be things that are hard for us to understand because they're not I'm hearing some echo here. I lost my thought. They're not contemporary to us in the same kind of way.
I was going to interject there. Have you ever watched a movie that was set in 1942 or something, and then they refer to the World War II as World War II during World War II? They didn't call it World War II during World War II. They didn't call World War I World War I during World War I because they didn't know it was going to be the first of two. Hopefully that was it. So it's one of those things where there are words that if you saw them, like you were talking about the toilet paper shortage, if you had seen that like 10 months ago, hey, remember the toilet paper shortage when nobody had to? No, I don't remember that at all. But you and I, all four of us, if I told you about a time when an airplane hit a building and then a second airplane hit a building, every single one of us not only has that reference, but we also have the vivid memories of it. And I think it might also be something, a complaint people have about Scripture is, how could these people have remembered it, decades after these things happened? And I'm thinking, 2001 is 20 years ago almost, and we remember it almost like it was yesterday. Now, granted, we've got video of everything that happened, but it was still pretty vivid. I don't think any of us have to have video to recall the emotions, what happened, and what we saw.
That's good.
Yeah, all good thoughts and comments on this topic. I think that certainly lays out some of the challenges we're going to encounter here as we kind of go through. So, with some of the limited time we have left, I really want to dive in and look at the Old Testament a little bit. Probably 2/3 of the time we're going to spend on this topic is really going to be focused on the New Testament, and we'll talk about why that is here in a little bit. But before we kind of go that direction, I do want to focus on the Old Testament just a little bit. So, first thing I think that's important to realize about the Old Testament is some of the Jewish scribe methodology. So, there were very strict limitations on who could make copies of the scriptures. There were a lot of rules associated with this as well. So, as well as limitations on who could make copies, there were also limitations on, what they could do for error correction, how they had to store the scrolls, what kind of animal skins could be used for these scrolls. And even though that a lot of the people in that time, given that it was a largely oral culture, and they had a lot of this memorized, when they were copying the scriptures, there were strict rules about not having a word copied from memory and not even having letters copied from memory. So it would, my understanding of the practice is very much that it would be check the letter, check the word, copy letter, go back, check again, copy letter. So the copying was extremely precise to prevent error. And they saw it as such an important duty that there were other practices within this copying, such as whenever copying the name of Yahweh, then, it was never to be with a newly dipped brush, or, the scribe was not to be distracted at all while copying Yahweh's name down. So there were really a lot of rules in place to prevent error transmission. We talk a lot about, telephone game earlier, but it's certainly very different looking at Old Testament transmission in terms of how they did it. It was not you tell me and I'll write it down, 50 years from now. The scribes had very strict rules for making sure the scriptures were maintained through transmission.
Yeah, and if I could add something to that, I think that there's a paradigm shift here from outside of the religion. You'd be tempted to think that they're writing stuff down and they'd like to do maybe just a little something here and there to make their religion a little bit more spectacular or exciting. And that's understandable from looking outside, but from within the religion, from those that are actually copying, you have to understand that they are true believers. They really believe that what they have here is the inspired word of God. And to try to change that goes against the very base of what they believe. These are the Jews, especially the Old Testament. These are people of the book. These are people of the law. It's like to even think about changing God's word is a total anathema. And so it's not the first thing that a scribe would want to do. It'd be the very last thing. So not only these rules are in place because they're just a good way to copy and they're good kind of ways to prevent errors. It's like they would in themselves appreciate this as part of this very careful process of preserving God's word exactly as it was given. And so there's not just a methodological way of doing this. I think people should understand that there's an internal desire to make sure that no errors are made. And sure, there were errors made. We're not saying that it was that they didn't make errors from time to time, and we can handle that. But just to understand that certainly the desire of those copying was to preserve.
That's a great point, Charles. And Susan commented that this wouldn't have been for an ADHD sufferer, and that's certainly true as well. I don't think that would have went very well given the precision of this kind of job.
I would have made a very bad scribe.
Excuse me, I'm writing down the name of God here. Look, a squirrel.
Yeah. So, and again, this is just to kind of get in that mindset we're talking about of looking at how they would have viewed this versus kind of our Western eyes of thinking about how copying is haphazardly done, maybe for an assignment or something like that versus what was viewed as a very sacred task. So just to kind of briefly touch on this, we've got a few minutes left. And this would be one of those slides people may want to take a picture of. We're not going to go into depth on all of this, but we want to touch on some of the archaeological evidence too. To call the Bible a book of mythology is to neglect a lot of the archaeological evidence that is actually out there for some of the events. I'm not saying all of the events, but for a good number of the events in the Bible, we have corresponding archaeological evidence. So you can't write the whole thing off as mythology. And again, we're just talking about the Old Testament here so far.
Now, the Old Testament, it was written in the Middle Ages?
No.
I have that from my notes. That guy said.
Oh, yeah.
It was not more than 2,000 years old.
Yeah, so the Old Testament would have been complete and would have been had already been translated into Greek in what was called the Septuagint at the time of Jesus. So we're talking, if my dates are right, somewhere from about 1200 BC. Is that on point? 1200 to 400 BC, I think, is some of the range that contemporary dates give.
Okay, so just to be clear, the majority of the Bible was indeed written before the birth of Christ.
That's right. Okay. 39 of the books were
track here.
Already around by then.
All right.
So, some of the examples of archaeological evidence we have for events in the Old Testament include the city of Sodom, which only recently archaeological evidence has actually discovered that this city and the region they believe it was in had a very mysterious destruction. And some suspect that it could have been a meteor, but for whatever reason, the city is just decimated very, very oddly in the archaeological discoveries they've made there. Now, we also have while we don't have a lot of as many manuscripts and stuff that go as far back, because a lot of the parchment used, even if it was animal skins, it's something that decays and degrades over time. So one thing we do have is a lot of steels from that time. These were essentially stone monuments of some kind. So a lot of the documentation from these kind of times is something that's documented in stone, at least what has survived. That's the case. And we've got references in Egypt to Israel being a foreign people. We've also got a stele that references the house of David. And then, of course, the Cyrus cylinder is one of the more famous pieces of archaeological evidence. It references Cyrus's conquest of Babylon. And then, of course, they've made archaeological discoveries of many of the locations, such as Jericho and Babylon. And Hezekiah's tunnel is one of my personal favorites. They didn't think this existed for a long time, and they found that there actually is this tunnel that runs under Jerusalem, and this tunnel is described in great detail as being an aqueduct that was built by Hezekiah in the Bible. And for many, I think it was only discovered in the last 80 years that they found this, and maybe even more recent than that. But they found essentially there is this great aqueduct that runs underneath the city.
Yeah, let's just say, as a point in fact, that probably for the last, especially the last 50 to 70 years, based on archaeology, that skeptics have been in a forced retreat due to archaeological evidence. The claims that there was no evidence here, no evidence there, they have been forced to retract time after time after time based on the archaeological evidence. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been a a corresponding retreat based on archaeology on our part.
That's right.
That's a pretty good record, right? It's like,
Yes.
here's this book, and it says like the city's here, and it's like this stuff's over here, and there's a tunnel here, and it's like
Right.
time after time after time. You know, there's no guys whose name was Pilate. There's no town. There's no this. There's no that. And it's like, oh wait, we found one. Oh wait, we found one. Oh wait, we found it. Oh, there's another one. It's like, at what point do you know, this progressive forced retreat? But anyway, I also want to know if they're made of stone, why they call them steels. Understand that?
I am not that much of an expert, so maybe Kevin knows the answer to that,
Also,
that one.
there's a typo in there. I think you misspelled steel.
No, it's just a transliteration from, I think, a Germanic word, actually. But
Really?
I'm not sure
Okay.
either.
Gosh, I could probably Google that, but maybe I'll do it later.
Okay, so I did include some pictures here. Again, these are great things for people to look up and go more in depth in. Each one's fascinating. If you're a fan
Right.
of history, you know, looking up and studying some of these artifacts is a blast. It's a real rabbit hole to go down.
Right. And right away, it just immediately distinguishes this subject matter from mythology in terms of, you know, an imaginative, fantastic tale not rooted in historical events. They're not only literary documentation, but this, you know, this physical remains even of real places, real people, real lives in these time periods that the Bible describes. You know, there's just nothing really like that in, say, you know, Hinduism or Buddhism or Zoroastrianism or the Book of Mormon. You know, you're talking about something entirely different here, something real.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. Christianity is disprovable by evidence, meaning that evidence could prove it false, which is maybe not true of some of the other religions. Some of the other religions might be, they could care less what evidence there is. They're more kind of just blind faith systems. But if it's potentially provable to be false, then it's also potentially provable to be true. It's just amazing the wealth that we have here. Gosh, I mean, without diving in, just like, think about it. They found the city of Jericho with walls that fell outward. It's pretty interesting.
That's most certainly true. And then the one last thing we'll touch on kind of tonight before putting a pause on this is, of course, one of the most significant archaeological finds probably ever, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were found back in the 40s and 50s, and 40% of it was copies of texts from the Hebrew Scriptures. The scrolls dated back to the 1st to 3rd century BC. So that would be well before our friend Hermit Meta even talked about the 2,000-year-old Bible. But the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of people have heard of them, but the significance is that within these scrolls, they were able to find copies of the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, that were much, much, much older than some of our earliest copies at that time. So in finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, what they were able to do is take a copy of the scriptures, for example, the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is the oldest complete copy of the book of Isaiah that we have. They were able to compare it to copies that were 300, 400, 500 years older than these copies they uncovered. And the significance of that is we can actually compare these 3rd, 4th, 5th century manuscripts, and we can compare them to first century BC manuscripts and see how many scribal errors and issues we actually have within a good number of the scriptures.
Yeah.
And
So
yeah, go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say, so to put it back into the metaphor that we're saying, it'd be like, so since we have kind of this very old pre-Christ document, and then we have a document that's like 4th and 5th century AD, it's like playing the telephone game, even though it's not like a telephone game, but to follow the metaphor, it'd be like playing the telephone game and getting to the end, and the last guy goes to the first guy, I heard this, and the guy goes, yeah, that's exactly right. Like you got everything right. You didn't miss anything. There was nothing lost in the translation there. That's basically what the Dead Sea Scrolls did. It said all the claims that copyists were making these errors and fabricating and adding was completely discredited by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, we started it here, and by the time we get like 500-600, oh my gosh, it's exactly the same. I guess they did take copying pretty seriously.
Yeah, and that's really, really significant
It's
from a
huge.
historical
It's huge.
perspective. I mean, that is why it's regarded as such a huge discovery, is because it does verify these much later texts that we have.
Gosh, and I'd like to just say, I really like what you said from a historical context, because, hey, let's just take our Christian hats off for the second, or whoever else might be listening. Let's just stop playing the religion game just for a second, and let's just look at what we have here historically only. And what we can at least say historically only is that whatever the Old Testament was at the time when it was stored in the location of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the copyists made minimal transcription errors over the last like 600, 700 years, historically speaking. And by the time, what that means and why that's significant is, so by the time we get to the 4th and 5th century, like, we have those. And so what it meant is, well, pretty much what we have before Christ all the way till now is an unbroken chain of fairly error-free Old Testament. Historically speaking, not religiously speaking, historically speaking.
And to that end, you said, and I feel like that's a good, fair assessment, fairly error-free. But there are errors, and I think it's actually really important to acknowledge the mistakes. People have said, that they really want to see that the Bible has no errors in it before they believe it. But in reality, if you think about the kinds of errors that are brought in, they kind of feel like somebody was copying and they screwed up from the number 40 and it was supposed to be 4,000, or vice versa. 4,000 was supposed to be 40. It's not, and those who have really studied it, and again, somebody who's probably got way more knowledge than I do, Caleb up there and Kevin, is the idea that these errors were not destructive to the actual message. They were secondary type errors. Again, it'd be like saying, hey, I cut my grass. When did you cut your grass? I cut it on Tuesday. I meant Tuesday of last week, or Tuesday of the week before. And it's not necessarily you didn't cut your grass and I can't believe you and I can't trust your message. It's more of, he just misremembered something, or something was a couple of characters off. There are words back in the old language that if you slightly misspell them, they mean something else, or, anyway, somebody else can probably take that and run with it.
No, we are absolutely going to touch on that. We'll probably get to that next week. We're going to look at that in great detail when looking at the New Testament. So we'll put pause on that one just until we get back around to it. But we're going to touch on that in great detail in the New Testament, and how some of those errors actually help us with ensuring that we have a accurate transmission of the scriptures. Just to wrap up real quick, many people take a major issue with the Old Testament. Some of these reasons that people have trouble with the Old Testament may be in regards to what they think it says about the age of the earth, claims of a worldwide flood, lack of evidence for the Exodus, Jonah being swallowed by a big fish, and some of these actually have very good alternative explanations from what some of the explanations that have been given for these in the last few hundred years are not necessarily the understanding that Christendom has had for a long time on some of these issues. So just because you may take issue with some of these things doesn't mean you should immediately write off the Old Testament, because particularly for these issues, I think there are some very good explanations out there. And, you know, you could certainly have a conversation with any one of us and discuss these issues, and we'd be glad to go into more detail. But again, this is the Old Testament we looked at tonight. And the big issue with the Old Testament is that it's reasonable to accept if the New Testament is reliable, because Jesus confirmed very much of the Old Testament. So if what we find out about the New Testament, if we find out it's had an accurate transmission, if we find out that there's any validity to some of the claims Jesus made about who he was, then it gives us another very good piece of evidence for looking at the Old Testament in light of Jesus's confirmation of much of the Old Testament. But again, I'm not denying that any of these things here are not issues that people take. They most certainly are. But again, looking at the Old Testament, there's good reason to suspect that at least not all of it's mythology. And this is, again, with the Christian hat off, looking at it historically, there's good reason to believe that it's reporting real historical events, that it's not all mythology, and that, you know, there's certainly something there, not to mention the fact that this is one of the oldest existing texts in history. Gives us good reason to at least look at it seriously. But coming back next week, we're really going to start to dive into the New Testament. That's where we're going to spend 2/3 of the time in this discussion, because the New Testament, if true, validates all the claims of Christianity. Any final thoughts, gentlemen? We ran just a little bit over tonight.
We got a lot of work to do.
True.
I would like, perhaps, if we have time somewhere, maybe at the end even would be a good place after we've gone over the material, to play that video that you started with once again. And just, you know, even if it's just kind of like a checklist, like, oh yeah, remember we talked about that, so we validated that, or we nullified that. Oh, he makes this claim here. Okay, remember we studied this, and just to go through to make sure that we have answered. So this guy's pretty famous. I mean, the Friendly Atheist, I've heard that site before. It's a well-known site, and so if we can go back and show academically that each one of those claims is either misleading or flat wrong, and even above and beyond that, we have just a abundance of evidence to support. I hope that would be convincing to some people.
That's a good idea. I think we should do that.
If not even maybe the Friendly Atheist. I mean, maybe he'll come to faith. Maybe he'll see the truth of the claims of Christianity and become the friendly Christian.
That'd be good. We need more friendly Christians.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I am going to wrap that up for the night. So thank you to everybody who watched. Sorry we didn't get to all your comments, Susan. Let Susan know we're sorry on that for not getting to every comment she left. So we appreciate the interaction, though, and especially the respectful interaction and being able to engage and discuss these issues. We hope that if you watch this later, that you will give it some thought and engage with this after the fact. I think any of us would be willing to take messages, to have discussions either via chat or over the phone. And if you leave questions, then we'll certainly address them in 2 weeks when we come back and look more at the New Testament. So thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful evening.